Hi, I'm Daniel Holter, and I'm going to talk about rationalization. Not the word as it's mostly used today, as in attempting to explain or justify something, but how this guy, Max Weber, described rationalization. Weber was a sociologist, historian, and political economist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He coined the term rationalization as a way of describing something which was happening to European society in the wake of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Weber describes rationalization as the replacement of traditions, values, and emotions as motivators for behavior in society, with concepts based on rationality and reason. Weber separated rationality into four types. Practical rationality, that thing we are doing all the time to make choices to achieve ends through calculation. Theoretical rationality, which is logical deduction of causality and arranging abstractions and symbolic meanings to things. Substantive rationality, which involves applying clusters of values to choices and actions. And formal rationality, which is standardized, institutionalized in bureaucracies, organizations, legal systems, and the capitalist economy. Modern sociologist and scholar on rationalization George Ritzer describes formal rationality in this way. The choice of means to ends is determined by these larger structures and their rules and laws. In looking for the best means of attaining a given objective under formal rationality, we are not left to our own devices, but rather we use existing rules, regulations, and structures that either predetermine the optimum methods or help us discover them. This clearly is a major development in the history of the world. In the past, people had to discover such mechanisms on their own, or with only vague and general guidance from larger value systems. Now we no longer have to discover for ourselves the optimum means to some given end, because that optimum means has already been discovered. It is incorporated into the rules, regulations, and structures of our social institutions. Let's say there's a person named Sam, and they want a house. In the absence of formal rationality, they might apply practical rationality, determining a few practical steps needed to be taken in order to acquire one, and taking steps informed by their values. Perhaps they think brutalist architecture an affront to God and all that is holy, grounding their sense of substantive rationality in what they might consider the ethics of beauty, what they like to think of as traditional, informed specifically for some reason by craftsman-style architecture. But in our modern society, they encounter constraints, which are the formal rationality of laws and bureaucracy, forced to use specific channels like licensed realtors, and going to an FDIC-insured bank for a mortgage, and then bid on a house and get denied or accepted. And if the bid is accepted, go into escrow, then closing, title insurance, home insurance, taxes, etc., all of which are very explicitly constrained and governed and standardized by the laws of their country, the laws of their state, and the laws of their town. Oh, and the only house, even close to their budget, that isn't a 2-hour commute from the job that they need to afford it, was a tract house in a suburban housing development that looks exactly like the houses of their 7,000 neighbors. But that's okay because the houses are vaguely in the craftsman style. It's just that the market economy drove the price of artisan spec houses massively up while suppressing wage growth over the last 6 decades, and rational actors accumulating capital within this system were given a very clear path to acquire more capital through this extremely efficient form of standardized housing development. When government regulations and competition make it difficult for smaller artisan players in the construction industry, so the only people dedicated to artistry really are building houses for the wealthy, and even an old house inside city limits, built at a time when houses were less standardized and had more character and with better materials, is massively expensive because of urbanization and gentrification, and because non-standardized things are now a luxury of the wealthy because of the rational logic of markets. And Sam would love to have their choices informed by truth and beauty and values, wanting the construction materials of their house to not contribute to global warming and not further the exploitation of impoverished laborers. But they have to make decisions within this very constrained set of choices that are mostly selected for them by the formal rationality of bureaucracy, state, and market. I'd like to briefly offer an example of an alternative illustration where formal rationality is not the predominant constraint on choosing where to live. If Sam was born among the Wendat, Iroquoian First Peoples of North America, the decision of where to live would be informed largely by tradition, which held that individuals would live in longhouses with their extended family. Where they lived would be determined by matrilineage, with 6 or more groups of fathers, mothers, and children living in one longhouse together, in one large longhouse family where children were collectively cared for. The location of this longhouse would change as the village moved every decade or two, a practice based on the practical, values-driven considerations of sustainability as they subsisted on farming practices and required forestry for wood. Moving every 10 years meant that the forest and soil could replenish. The Wendat were animistic and considered the land as a sacred entity, practicing a responsibility-based approach to land stewardship. This type of religion is specifically highlighted by Weber as traditional rather than rationalized because of how it views the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds, and that's a subject we will get to later on. And the nature of this choice highlights a few things that I think are useful to consider in the topic of rationalization. I initially learned about the Wendat from David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything. Graeber and Wengrow don't speak specifically about rationalization, but they give an account of human history that defies stage theories, and we're going to talk about that later. They share modern archaeological evidence and anthropological research that shows that the course of history isn't at all like Yuval Harari put it in his book, Sapiens, where he depicted a prehistoric, Edenic, egalitarian state of nature as hunter-gatherers, which was turned institutional and hierarchical after we flipped the switch of adopting agriculture, leading to where we are today, caught up in a web of what Weber calls the iron cage of formal rationality and capitalism. But instead they show how humans have experimented back and forth with hierarchical, more rationalized forms and flat egalitarian forms, not on the basis of subsistence or their material conditions as Harari would have it, but for a lot of reasons. They argue that we are now stuck in a particular form which is capitalism-oriented, highly hierarchical, with great inequality, and experimentation with other forms is basically impossible because we lack 3 basic forms of social liberty. The first is the freedom to move away or relocate from one's surroundings. Members of a Wendat tribe could simply leave to another area and try something else, or join another group. The second is the freedom to ignore or disobey commands. In Dawn of Everything, Wengrow and Graeber share how authority in Wendat culture was largely charismatic, and people could simply ignore those designated leaders and choose others at will if they showed poor judgment. This highlights a lack of a type of power that Weber ties to rationalization, called rational legal authority, the primary authority type wielded by our bureaucracies and our governments. The third freedom is the freedom to shape new social realities or shift back and forth between different ones. They say that the first 2 freedoms act as a kind of scaffolding for the third. Here's how they describe it in the book. As long as the first 2 freedoms were taken for granted, as they were in many North American societies when Europeans first encountered them, the only kings that could exist were always, in the last resort, play kings. If they overstepped the line, their erstwhile subjects could always ignore them or move someplace else. The same would go for any other hierarchy of offices or system of authority. As much as our American version of Sam might love to select traditional Wendat life over living in the iron cage of capitalism, where they will be forced into an ugly box and a pile of ugly boxes, far from nature and alienated from neighbors. The rationalization of society, with all of the constraints of formal rationality, specific processes constrained by laws, informed by capitalism, and the constraints of the market, all of this essentially means there is no land that is unowned. You cannot simply choose to build your own house on your own. You cannot build your own social system and ignore the state. Oh, and it's illegal to be homeless. So American Sam is forced to get a job, pay for their box, or go to jail. Sam is not likely to be able to afford their box if they don't get a good job in a growing industry. And getting hired might be a matter of going to the right school and getting the right degree. And getting into that school might be a matter of getting good grades in an accredited public school. As a result of rationalization, increasingly more aspects of life come down to predefined paths with built-in values derived from the assumption that if the market wants it, there should be more of it, and it should be generated more efficiently because that is what grows the economy. Even if that means shrinking the people within it, segmenting them, categorizing, manipulating, shaping, diminishing to what Marcuse and Nick Susanis might call one-dimensional man living in flatland. Before I close part one of this series, I think it's important to highlight how rationalization is not inherently a good or a bad thing. Much good has come from large-scale agriculture, from governments organized into hierarchies and bureaucracies, from the scientific discoveries produced by universities, often a result of government grants. So the output of rational processes enabled by formal rationality. The market economy has been an engine of abundance, while also being the logical precursor to scarcity and about as severe a type of inequality as can be imagined. I think what's most important about recognizing the nature of these rationalizing systems is knowing under what conditions they are likely misapplied or excessive, where they will have runaway compounding negative effects, when they are at odds with the natural complexity of individuals and social groups and ecological systems, which cannot be turned rational and therefore are harmed by the excessive imposition of these systems. I think it's informative to note that when David Graeber called himself an anarchist, he was really saying that groups and individuals should have the capacity for self-determination, even if that meant they wanted to live in a self-imposed iron cage, which explains why he focused his book with David Wengrow on those three key freedoms. I might be wrong about that. In part two of this series, I'm going to go more in depth into the relationship that Weber saw between the Protestant church and capitalism, and therefore the rationalization of Europe and American society. I'm going to talk about Broicism and hustle culture and Schiller and disenchantment and the Jena set and positivism. And I would love to get to all of that and Seeing Like a State and more, but we'll see where I get when I get there. This is very much me muddling through the process, and I am enjoying the journey. If you have thoughts or disagreements or want to call me a cultural Marxist or whatever, put those in the comments or reach out to me. I'm excited about this topic and excited about sociology. I'm not going to tell you to like or share. I'm going to not try and intervene in whatever rational or traditional or vibes-based process you have for making such choices. Thanks for watching.